The Mafia's Good Girl, Chapter 10. Violet's point of view. "Take off your clothes," he ordered. Violet paused for a moment to let the words sink in. Okay, this is the end. Seeing that she didn't have any other options, Violet's hand slowly pulled the zipper of her dress. The dress fell and pulled around her feet. Violet was now left in her white bra and underwear. She looked up to see Damon's eyes turning dark, and she was shaking on the inside. A man had never seen her like this before, and her hands went to cover her body instinctively. "Don't ever cover yourself in front of me. Do you understand?" Damon barked. His hands removed Violet's hands from her body. Violet's cheeks blushed bright pink, and she nodded her head meekly. "Good girl," he said. His hands then went around her bra until they found the clasp, and the bra came off with ease. Violet knew this wasn't the first time Damon had to deal with bra. Damon let the bra fall on the floor and studied the sight before him. Violet was a small girl. She was only a B-cup, nothing fancy. Damon's eyes were glued to her chest, and she was feeling insecure again, but Damon licked his lips and let out an appreciative groan. His hands went to grab her breasts, and Violet drew a sharp breath. He began to cup and massage her breasts, and Violet couldn't stop squirming and writhing. He rolled his fingers over her nipples, pinching and pulling at them, and they soon became erect. Damon took it as a good sign, and the smile on his face went wider. He pulled away suddenly and stepped back, leaving Violet hanging on the edge. "Now, I'm gonna need you to lay down here," he said as he tapped on the wooden desk. Violet looked at the big wooden table for a moment. "I guess this is it. This is where I'm going to lose it." Wearing nothing but her underwear, Violet stepped closer to the desk, sat down, and lay flat on her back. The desk felt cold and hard against her skin. Violet didn't ask for a bed made of roses for when she loses her virginity, but she never thought it would be like this. "This is just a business deal. Nothing more, nothing less." Violet kept repeating those words in her head like a mantra. Every time she felt like crying or breaking down, she reminded herself that this was just a business trade. It would be over very soon, and life would be better for her and her family afterward. "You're not nervous, are you?" Damon's voice pulled her back to reality. He was standing over her legs, and Violet didn't dare look in his direction. She averted her gaze to the ceiling instead. "A little bit," she admitted. "I'm gonna need you to relax," Damon said. "How can I possibly relax in this situation?" "Take a deep breath," he said again, as if he could read her mind. Violet obeyed and took a deep breath. Her insides were twisting into knots, and her chest was beating hard. The deep breaths weren't helping, but Violet stayed completely still, thinking she could fake it until she made it. Meanwhile, Damon's hand slowly went to her sides, capturing the band of her underwear. He linked his fingers underneath the fabric before pulling them down her legs. Violet realized what was happening, and she refused to look down in embarrassment. She figured she'd keep her gaze straight to the ceiling for the rest of the night. It would be much safer that way. "Don't worry," Violet rose. "This will be over soon. Just keep your eyes up and let him get this over with." Violet's underwear fell to the floor, and she was left completely exposed to Damon. He stood tall, hovering over her, and she felt like a patient on an operating table, being observed by the doctor. She felt so vulnerable and powerless. Violet knew what was coming now, and she scrunched her eyes closed, thinking it was going to protect her from what was happening. Violet could feel Damon's hand on both her ankles and arched her legs upward. Her legs were parted open, with her knees sticking up. This made her lower part completely open and visible for him. Violet could feel her body shaking in fear, but she tried her hardest not to squirm or cry. "You're afraid, aren't you?" Damon said to her. "You have nothing to be afraid of." Yet, Violet didn't know if that was supposed to be a calming remark, because it did the absolute opposite. All the hairs in her body were standing up in response. And now she could hear the sound of his low chuckle, and she felt him moving to her side. "Open your eyes," he said. Violet bit her lips and shook her head lightly. "I said, open your eyes, Violet." His tone dropped an octave lower, and Violet's eyes jerked open instantly. "Good girl." He smirked. Damon put a hand on her cheek, and Violet gasped at the contact. His hand was big and muscular, and his skin felt rough against hers. Damon slowly traced his fingers down her body, starting from her chin down to her neck and chest. The movement was sending shivers up and down her spine. Violet kept her eyes open, as Damon's eyes were still on her. Her body began to squirm, as Damon's fingers now landed on her stomach, and it kept making their way down south. "What are you doing?" Violet found herself stammering. Damon moved to stand in front of her legs again, and his fingers were probing towards her entrance. "I just want to check something," he said. He leaned closer into her legs, and his two hands pulled her folds open. He was leaning so close that Violet could feel his warm breaths against her sensitive, raw skin. A man had never touched her there before, or came so close to her like this. Violet didn't know what to think or feel. She was writhing and blushing like mad. Her heart felt like it was about to drop down from her chest. "Fuck," Damon hissed. "What?" she asked. "You're a fucking beautiful little girl," he smirked. Violet could feel one of his fingers swiping and circling around her entrance. "And I can still see your hymen. You really did never touch yourself, huh? Why would I lie about that?" She responded. Damon's eyes shot up, and another smirk escaped his lips. He then pulled his fingers away, and Violet let out a sigh of relief. Violet knew, however, that this wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. Damon walked again to her side, and his hand landed on her stomach. Violet tried her hardest not to think about how her skin was burning under his touch. She wished she could close her eyes, but she knew Damon would get angry, so she didn't. She just lay there, endured every second of this torturous thing. Damon's hand found its way down to her entrance again, and he had two fingers running up and down her folds. Violet felt uncomfortable and restless. She wanted to close her legs, but Damon saw right through it. He used his elbow to push her thigh down, and he used his other hand to keep her other leg in place. "Don't even think of it," he whispered in a threatening tone. Violet swallowed hard. There was no use in fighting. All she could do now was lay there and take whatever it is Damon wanted to do to her. Violet's eyes were back on the ceiling again as Damon brought his index finger to her clit. Her breath hitched as he rubbed and pinched her sensitive bud. Violet never felt anything like it before. She felt a pit building inside her stomach, and whatever Damon was doing, it was pushing her further, and was no use in fighting. All she could do now was lay there and take whatever it is Damon wanted to do to her. Violet's eyes were back on the ceiling again as Damon brought his index finger to her clit. Her breath hitched as he rubbed and pinched her sensitive bud. Violet never felt anything like it before. She felt a pit building inside her stomach, and whatever Damon was doing, it was pushing her further and further into the edge. "How does this feel, Violet?" he said as his fingers continued rubbing against her. His thumb was pressed against her clit, and his index finger circled around her entrance. "I don't know. Does it feel good?" Violet didn't know what to say that. She kept quiet as the fire in her stomach grew bigger and bigger. "Answer me, Violet," he demanded. "Yes, good girl." Violet immediately regretted saying that she liked it. She wasn't supposed to like it. This was only a business exchange. But it was too late. She already said it, and he heard her. Damon's fingers moved even more erratically, and she felt something wet pooling around her entrance. Look at you," he groaned appreciatively. "You so wet and ready." Violet could feel her stomach clenching. Her whole body felt tensed, and it was aching for a release she didn't know what. Damon pressed his fingers tighter against her, putting on more pressure. And just when she thought she was going to get a release, Damon suddenly pulled his hand away. "Okay, that's it for today." He turned his back on her rather abruptly, and he started rolling down his sleeves. "What?" Violet gaped. She was lying naked on a wooden desk, her stomach twisting into knots, and her core was wet and throbbing. "Get your clothes and go back to your room," Damon said as he reached for his suit jacket. Violet didn't move an inch. She didn't even blink. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What?" she asked again. "You heard me," he said as he turned back to her, meeting her confused gaze. "But you thought I was going to make it easy for you," he scoffed. Damon let out a smirk and leaned closer to her. "No, I want to take my time with you. This isn't going to be easy or fast." Violet's jaw dropped open in shock. Damon stifled a laugh as he found it absolutely entertaining. He then put his finger into his mouth and licked it dry, the same finger that he was using to touch her minutes ago. What in the world? Violet was dumbfounded, and she never got another answer from Damon. He simply turned around and headed for the door. Violet lay breathless, naked and confused on the wooden table. She really couldn't believe what was happening. Damon stopped for a moment before he reached for the door. He turned his face hallway to her and said, "I'll see you tomorrow night, sweet girl." It was such a bizarre night. Violet lay on that table for a few more seconds before she realized Damon really wasn't coming back. She then grabbed her clothes, put them on, and returned to her room. She was flustered, confused, and scared. What does this mean? Why is he delaying this? Violet couldn't get a wink of sleep. So much, and yet so little, happened the past hour, and she didn't know what to make of it. She could finally fall asleep at the crack of dawn, and she woke up the next morning, still with the same questions and fear haunting her. "I want to take my time with you. This isn't going to be easy or fast." Violet spent her morning in anxiety, thinking over Damon's words from last night. And by the time the afternoon rolled around, she had to answer Dylan's question of why she wasn't coming home today. She could barely understand what was happening, let alone explaining it to someone else. "He hasn't done it yet," Violet said to Dylan on the phone. She went out to the garden again, thinking she could read a book for some peace and quiet. But it was clear to her there was no peace as long as she lived here in the estate. "What are you talking about?" Dylan yelled on the phone. "You're supposed to be home yesterday." "I know, but he hasn't done anything." Violet couldn't find the right words to describe what last night was. The deal was for Damon to take her virginity, and technically that hadn't happened yet. "So then he's just keeping you there?" Dylan asked. "For how long?" "I don't know." Violet sighed. You need to come home," Dylan said. "I want to come home, Dial, but the deal's not done yet. And I don't know how much longer he's going to keep me here." Violet threw her gaze out to the garden, and even though it was a beautiful sight, she knew she didn't belong here. She was only supposed to stay here for a night. It shouldn't take this long for someone to take her virginity. Damon was clearly playing a trick on her, purposefully prolonging her torture. 3 nights. Violet suddenly heard a voice. She turned her head around and saw a girl with wavy black hair and fair skin standing before her. "What?" Violet asked. 3 nights. "That's usually when Damon breaks," the girl said with a smile. Dial, I'm gonna have to call you back," Violet said to the phone, and she ended the call, much to Dylan's protests. The Mafia's Good Girl, Chapter 11. Violet's point of view. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I was just passing by, and I overheard your conversation," the girl said to Violet with a sweet smile. "You said 3 days?" Violet asked. This was the thing that intrigued her the most. Finally, there was someone who had all the answers. "How? Do you know? Damon does this a lot." The girl chuckled and rolled her eyes. "But when he knows that he wants something, he has to get it. He won't be able to wait too long. That's why his limit is usually 3 days. Violet fell silent and thought about her words. Damon had done this kind of thing often, and it would usually take 3 days. "Who are you?" Violet asked the girl. I'm Talia Luciano. Nice to meet you. The girl stretched out her hand. Violet shook it politely. You're Violet, right? She said again. How did you know? My husband told me about you. He picked your brother up from the hospital. Oh, Adrian, the consigliere. Violet then remembered. He was Adrian Luciano, the guy that came to them at the hospital. This girl was his wife, Talia. She was beautiful and probably in her early 20s. Adrian himself couldn't be more than 25. When she watched MAFIA movies, usually these guys were a lot older. Violet wondered how they could be in such a position at a very young age. You remembered my husband. You must have a great memory, Talia smiled. Well, it's not every day a Mafia's consigliere came over to me, and… Violet paused and quickly corrected herself. I'm sorry, I don't know if I am allowed to say that. You can say whatever you want in here, Talia giggled. But outside of these gates, you might have to be more careful. Violet let out a smile and nodded in agreement. Anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to eavesdrop on your conversation. I was just passing by to get to the kitchen. Talia pointed to a cottage across the hill and to the main building. Do you also live here? Violet asked. Well, I live in that house over there with Adrian. She pointed to the small cottage. Violet threw her gaze over the green grassy hill, and she realized there was more than one cottage in the back. Not to mention that the main building itself was as big as a castle. It probably had more than 20 bedrooms. Wow, this place is bigger than I thought, Violet said. I can give you a tour if you want. Talia asked. Violet paused for a moment to think. Talia seemed like a great girl, and she seemed to know a lot of things about Damon. Violet wanted nothing more than to know about her upcoming fate, so she nodded her head vigorously. A tour would be lovely. Thank you. Violet spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the estate with Talia. Talia was a chatty girl, and she didn't hold back on the storytelling. Talia explained how the old Mafia king, Joseph Luciano, who was Adrian's uncle, took Damon in as an orphan. Damon was raised and groomed as his successor. At one point, Damon was also supposed to marry Joseph's daughter, Isabella. But after an unfortunate accident that took both Joseph's and Isabella's life, Damon was forced to take over the estate as a lone wolf. Adrian never wanted to be involved with the Mafia ever since he was young. He was actually studying to be a lawyer. But after that accident, Adrian felt the need to help his family, so he came back and became Damon's consigliere. You guys must be very close, Violet commented. Oh yes, Talia nodded. We grew up together, the four of us, Isabella, Damon, Adrian, and I. My father was Joseph Luciano's #1 hand. We all lived here, in the estate. Talia then took Violet to her cottage and showed her an old photo album. There were pictures of a young Talia, probably at 13, smiling next to Adrian and Damon, who were about the same age. There was also another girl there. She was absolutely beautiful, even at such a young age. She was slightly younger than the rest of them, probably about 11. Violet guessed she must be Isabella. Things were a lot simpler back then. Violet sighed as she looked at the old photos. She graciously brought over a cup of tea for Violet, and Violet took it. Thank you, she said, and sipped her tea. Oh, what I would give to be 13 again, Talia said, speaking like was an old lady in her 60s. 10 years have gone by, and so many things have changed since then. You're 23? Violet asked. Yup. I'm 23. Adrian's 25 this year. And Damon's 26. He's 26 years old? Violet almost blurted her tea out. He does look older, doesn't he? Talia giggled. I've been telling him. All that stress isn't good for his skin. Violet paused for a moment to think. Damon Van Zandt, the Mafia king who was buying her virginity for $1 million. He was only 26 years old. Judging from the way he walked and talked, Violet had assumed he was somewhere in his 30s. And his eyes too. It seemed like they had seen a lot, far more than what a 26-year-old was supposed to see. Ring! The sound of a phone ringing pierced through the air, and it cut through Violet's daydream. Talia quickly pulled out her phone and walked a few steps away from Violet on the couch. "Hello?" Talia said into the phone. "Oh yes. She's with me." "Nothing. I'm just showing her around the estate. I'm stuck here, and it's not every day I meet a girl around my age that wants to be my friend." She let out another giggle and exchanged glances with Violet. Violet smiled back at her. "All right, I'll tell her. Bye," Talia said and hung up the phone. "You don't really go out of the estate?" Violet asked. "No, for safety reasons." Talia shrugged. "Anyway, that was Adrian. He told me Damon's looking for you. He wants you in his office at 8. "Oh." Violet glanced at the clock, and she suddenly remembered something. They had been talking past sundown, and 8 o'clock was only an hour away. "What's wrong?" Talia asked her, noting her nervous expression. "Talia, tonight's my 3rd night here," she said. "The first night was when she first arrived at the estate and signed that contract. The second night was last night when Damon tried some things on her. And tonight was the 3rd night. Oh well, congratulations, I guess," Talia said cautiously. "This is what you want, right? And you want to get it over with so you can go home?" "Well, yes, but—" Violet paused because she didn't know the right words to say. "Are you scared?" Talia guessed. Violet nodded her head meekly. "A little bit." Violet thought she was ready for this, but every time the moment came upon her, she always felt nervous and afraid. "I'm sorry," Talia said in a whisper. She forced out a smile. "Why are you sorry? Damon shouldn't be doing this to poor innocent girls, but hurt people, you know." Violet didn't know what Talia meant by that. But before she could ask anything else, Talia already got up to her feet. "You should head back before it gets too dark. Come on, I'll walk you," she said again. "Oh, okay." Violet put down the photo album and the cup of tea. "Thank you for the tea and for keeping me company." "It's my pleasure. I'm actually a little sad that I won't get to see you tomorrow." "It's kind of nice having a girl around here for once," Talia smiled. Violet stood up and followed Talia towards the door. Talia was reaching for the door handle, but she stopped her tracks suddenly. "Oh, and Violet." "Yeah? Please don't tell anyone I've shown you all those photos. Especially Damon. Don't say anything to him about this. And don't ever bring up Isabella." Talia had a nervous look on her face, and Violet narrowed her eyes at her. "Why?" "Trust me, you don't want to know," she said simply and opened the door. By 8 o'clock that night, Violet had already taken a shower, got dressed, and brushed her hair. Physically, she was as ready as she would ever be. But mentally, she was still fighting it. She remembered wanting to cancel the deal, but she was already in too deep. "I might as well get it over it," she thought. So even though her heart was nervous and her hands were shaky, Violet knocked on Damon's office door at 8 o'clock sharp. "Come in." Damon's voice was heard, and Violet pushed the door open. Damon was seated on his desk like usual. He was wearing his signature jet black suit and crisp white shirt. He looked up to see her and pointed to a chair placed in the middle of the office room. "Sit down," he said. Violet closed the door behind her and walked over to the chair. Violet thought it was an odd place to put a chair. It was standing alone in the middle of the room and too far away from Damon's desk. But still, she sat down anyway. Once she was seated, Damon got up to his feet and slowly undid his tie. Violet swallowed hard as she knew what was coming next. Damon's tie was hanging loosely around his neck as he stood tall before her. He then wrapped his tie around his hand like a bandage and checked its strength. He pulled the tie harshly, and it didn't break. Damon let out a smile. Violet didn't know what was happening. She sat in silence and watched as Damon circled around her. He was now standing behind her, and she felt his hands resting on the head of the chair. "So, I have some plans for you today." Violet heard his husky voice spoke, and on the corner of her eye, she saw Damon's hand that was bandaged with his tie landing on her shoulder. "What plans?" she asked. Damon didn't answer her right away. Instead, he ran his hand down her body. His hand grazed against her breasts, over her dress, and Violet let out a gasp. His hand continued its way down south, and it rested over her lower stomach. His fingers began to apply pressure, and he started rubbing her lower area over the fabric of her dress. Violet tried her hardest to stay still, but her body was squirming in response. Damon's hand was now cupping her lower area rather roughly, and it caused Violet's hand to reach up. She pushed Damon's hand away instinctively. "Please," she begged. Damon let out a low chuckle, and it wasn't because he found it funny. He sounded rather irritated. "Here's the thing. You're a lot more inexperienced than I thought. So before we go any further, there are some things I need you to learn." Before Violet could ask anything else, Damon grabbed both her hands from the back and pulled them roughly behind the chair. "Ouch!" she yelped, but Damon didn't stop. He put his tie over her hands and tied them together. It was so tight, Violet could feel her blood flow stopping over her wrists. "Damon, that hurts," she protested. "Good. It should hurt," he said instead. Violet struggled to free her hands, but it only made things even worse. Every little friction hurt. Meanwhile, Damon circled back to her front and stood smirking before her. "What are you doing?" she asked. Damon took a moment to see the fear and terror in her eyes. It made his smile grow wider. "Don't worry. Tonight you're just going to watch," he said. Then he turned around and walked to the bookshelf behind his desk. "Watch?" she asked. Damon had his back to Violet, and he was pushing some kind of button on the bookshelf. Seconds later, the shelf popped open, revealing a hidden door. Damon cracked the door open, and a girl with long legs and long blonde hair appeared before them. She was wearing a set of underwear made of black latex, black gloves, and nothing else. "Oh, master," she purred as she put her arms around Damon. "I've missed you so much." Violet's mouth fell open as she couldn't believe what was happening. Damon stepped away from the girl and walked over to the desk. The girl followed him immediately. "We're gonna have an audience today. Make sure you give her a good show," Damon said, as he kept his gaze straight at Violet. The blonde girl took one look at Violet before rolling her eyes back to Damon. "Yes, master," she said. Damon had that devilish smirk playing on his face as the blonde girl began to undress him, starting with his suit jacket. Violet tried to struggle her hands free again, but it still wasn't working. "Damon, please," Violet begged. "Why are you doing this to me?" Damon was now shirtless. Violet could see his toned muscles, tanned skin, and black tattoos running across his body. The blonde girl ran her fingers all over his body, and Damon pushed her down until she was kneeling before him. She took the order and started unbuckling his belt. "Because I'm going to make you enjoy this, Violet," Damon replied. "Just as much as I do." Violet's eyes were wide as saucers and her mouth fell open, but there were no words. She was absolutely speechless. This was her third night here. They've made a deal, and her torment should be over by now. Damon let out another smirk, and Violet couldn't help but feel cheated. He's doing this on purpose. He's enjoying this. Playing with me. Violet couldn't break free, and there was nothing she could do but endure this torture for another night. She didn't want to look weak and gave Damon that satisfaction, so even though it was killing her, Violet sat still and continued watching. The blonde girl was now slowly unzipping Damon's pants, revealing the bulge under his boxer briefs. After spending 3 nights at the estate, Violet learned a big lesson today. Never make a deal with the devil, because he will screw you over. And over. And over. The Mafia's Good Girl, Chapter 12. Damon's point of view. Violet was glaring at Damon in frustration and protest, but Damon only found it amusing. Ever since he realized how inexperienced she was in this business, Damon saw an opportunity to capitalize on his purchase. He could have taken her virginity that very first night after she signed the deal, or he could tease and test her patience and see how far he could stretch out his amusement. Damon knew she must be feeling cheated right about now, but he didn't care. It wasn't his fault that she never asked for a deadline on the exchange of the deal. She was also far too inexperienced for his liking that he felt the need to teach her some things because he wanted to maximize the pleasure he would gain from this exchange. $1 million was no small change, and Damon was determined to make it worth every penny. Yes, this may look like a chaotic mess, but there was a method to his madness. Master, you are so ready. Sabrina, Damon's #1 girl of the week, purred in pleasure as she pulled Damon's zipper down. Her hand reached for the bulge in his boxer briefs. When Sabrina pulled out Damon's semi-erect length, Damon kept his eyes on Violet, and he saw how her eyes widened. This was probably the first time she ever saw a penis in real life. He was a good length and had girth, circumcised and with veins popping on the side. Sabrina licked her lips before she started planting kisses all over Damon's tip. Violet looked horrified, and she immediately put her head down. She was also closing her eyes, absolutely scared to see the scene unfolding before her. "Open your eyes, Violet." Damon barked an order. "You should be watching and learning." Violet could have disobeyed him. Technically, this wasn't part of the deal, but Violet chose to obey. She opened her eyes slightly and looked up. Damon liked this about her. Damon kept his eyes on Violet as Sabrina continued pleasing him. Her hands were holding his base, and she started sucking and taking more of his length into her mouth. Damon noticed that Violet's legs began to squirm. He knew this was doing something inside her. Damon let out a smirk, and he grabbed a fistful of Sabrina's blonde hair. He used his strength to hold Sabrina's head in place while he mercilessly drilled his length into her mouth. He went so far and so deep, Sabrina was gagging and tears rolled down her face. Violet had that horrified look on her face again, but Damon didn't stop. He pushed himself so deep until his tip hit the back of Sabrina's throat, and he kept himself there until she was out of breath. "Fuck yes," he groaned. Sabrina was panting for air, but Damon didn't let her rest for more than 2 seconds. He cupped her face so that her mouth fell open and plunged his length into her mouth again. For the next few minutes, Damon continued fucking the hell out of Sabrina's mouth, and Violet could only watch in fear. At one point, Damon's eyes met Violet, and the fear in her eyes only fueled him even more. He was so rough with Sabrina, her face was turning red and blue. Violet looked absolutely concerned, but he only smiled in response. And once Damon was satisfied, he pulled out of Sabrina's mouth and let his grip go. She fell straight onto the floor, gagging and panting for dear life. "Stand up," Damon ordered. "Yes, master," Sabrina said through her breath as she stood up. She was wearing a pair of 6-inch heels, and she struggled a little to get up. "Turn around," he said. Sabrina complied and turned around. She was standing in front of Damon with her back to him, and she was facing Violet. "Bend down." Sabrina locked eyes with Violet, and she let out a smile. Violet was concerned for her, but Sabrina was enjoying this. She didn't need Violet's pity. She bent down slowly and on purpose, making sure her ass was sticking out for Damon, and her boobs were pushed forward in Violet's direction. "All the way." Damon barked and put a hand to the back of her neck, pushing Sabrina all the way down to the floor. Her hands landed on the ground to support her body, while her ass was sticking up high in the air. Damon then took off his leather belt and wrapped it around his hand. "You once said that sex is just a reproductive act, but I beg to differ," he said as he slowly walked around Sabrina's body. He kept his eyes on Violet and let out a devilish grin. "Allow me to prove my point." In one swift move, Damon slapped the belt across Sabrina's ass, and the girl flinched in response. Violet gasped in shock, but Sabrina remained quiet. Damon stood further away from Sabrina, and he hit her again with the belt, 3 more times. "Ah!" Sabrina finally broke out in a cry. Violet's eyes and body were frozen still. She was absolutely mortified. It was like a car wreck she couldn't turn away from. Damon then threw his belt to the ground and stood right behind Sabrina's sore ass. He yanked her latex underwear down until it pulled around her feet and gave her ass another slap using his hand. "Ah, master, please," Sabrina begged. Damon positioned himself behind her and ran his length along her wet entrance. He pushed himself inside her with ease, and she let out a hot moan. Damon kept his hands on her sides, gripping on her skin tightly as he pounded himself into her, deep and hard. "Oh, master, you feel so good," she said as her body shook with his movements. Damon looked up to see the expression on Violet's face. She looked like a lost lamb standing in front of a slaughterhouse. Her mouth fell open and her lips were quivering. The fact that he was torturing her psychologically was so enjoyable to him. It was even better than the sex he was having. "Master, I'm so close. Please, can I come?" Sabrina begged. "Not yet." Damon let out another smirk and he pulled out. Sabrina sighed and moaned. Her body wanted to protest. "Get up!" Damon pulled her roughly by her arms and turned their positions sideways. From this angle, Violet could see everything clearly and visibly. Both of Sabrina's arms were behind her back, and Damon held them tightly with one hand. Then he pushed her down slightly, so her ass was sticking out to him again. Damon used his other hand to start probing on Sabrina's asshole. He looked to the side to see Violet's expression, and she looked even more horrified than ever. "Oh my God!" Sabrina yelped in pain and pleasure as Damon pushed his tip into her tight asshole. She didn't have any preparation, and it must have hurt like hell. A single tear rolled down her face, and Damon relentlessly pushed deeper. "How does that feel?" Damon said in that low and husky voice. "That feels amazing, master," she replied. "I love it when you fill all my holes." Damon kept his grip tightened on her sides as he started pounding into her. He didn't even give her time to adjust, and he just kept taking over and over again. Sabrina was moaning and groaning in pain, but after some time, her painful moans turned into pleasure. "Master, please, let me come," she begged. Her body was tensed and her stomach was clenching. "Please, can I come?" "Come," Damon ordered, and within seconds, Sabrina came unraveling underneath him. She let out a scream as her orgasm took over her body. She was shaking and shuddering uncontrollably. Violet gasped in fear as she didn't know what to make of it. "Fuck." Damon cursed as he picked up the pace with his thrusts. He kept his gaze locked on Violet as his throbbing length pushed further and harder into Sabrina's tight hole. He could only imagine what Violet's virgin hole would feel like against his skin. One day, he would find out, but not today. Damon let out another string of curses as he spilled his seed into Sabrina's asshole. She moaned appreciatively and stuck her ass out even further for him. Damon emptied himself into her, and once he was done, he pulled away and let her limp body fall to the ground. He adjusted himself back in his pants and pulled his zipper up, all the while maintaining eye contact and a smile at Violet. "Go get out of here," he muttered at Sabrina. "Yes, master." "Thank you, master," she said as she picked herself up and sashayed towards the door. Before she completely exited the room, however, she took one look at Violet and let out a scoff. Violet was frozen still in complete shock and disbelief. This was the first time she had ever seen anyone having sex, and she didn't know what to make of it. Was a guy supposed to be that rough? Damon cocked his head at Violet and slowly walked over. He saw how her body tensed harder with each step he took. She was absolutely scared of him. She flinched when he reached over her shoulder and scrunched her eyes shut. Luckily for her, he was only aiming for the tie tying her hands. He undid the tie, and Violet's hands fell free. "Now, did you enjoy the show?" He grinned. Violet looked up at him in complete disdain, and before he could say anything else, her hand reached up and slapped him across the face. The sound was ringing in the air, and time felt like it stopped. Violet's mouth fell open like she wanted to say something, but nothing was coming out. Damon's eyes were wide open, and they were staring straight at Violet. Damon didn't see that coming at all. No one in their right mind would dare lay a finger on him, and this girl, this helpless little girl, did. Without saying another word, Violet then got up to her feet and turned for the door. Damon could only stare in disbelief as his face started to sting. Damon's hand instinctively went to his cheek as he watched the door close before him. At first, he was just mad, but now a small smile suddenly curved up his stoic face. Violet just did something she couldn't take back, and Damon would definitely make her pay for it. Violet's point of view. Violet raced out of the room and back into her bedroom as fast as she could. She didn't know what came onto her, but she was just so mad she couldn't help it. Damon was torturing and playing with her mind on purpose, and she hated it. She hated what he made her do. She hated that she chose to put herself in this position in the first place. Violet closed the door shut to her room before throwing herself on the bed. She realized she had made a terrible choice. Not even $1 million was worth this kind of torment. Violet reached for her phone, and she started thinking of ways to end this deal and go home. But before she could think too far, she heard the doorknob rattle and the door creaked open. Violet jumped to her feet instinctively. She looked up and saw Damon standing at her door. Violet swallowed hard. Damon's eyes were burning in fiery anger. There was also a clear red mark on his left cheek, the place where Violet slapped him. Damon closed the door behind him and slowly made his way over to her. Violet shuddered and stepped back. "What are you gonna do to me?" she asked him. "You hit me," he pointed out. His voice was low and dangerous. "But you tricked me," she argued. "You're supposed to take my virginity, but instead, you're keeping me here and you made me watch that." "Hey, it's not my fault you never read the fine print," Damon said. Violet wanted some distance between them, but she couldn't back away anymore as her back was flushed against the wall. He let out a smirk and stepped closer, giving her no chance of escaping. "Well, fine, you know what? I am done," Violet spat. "The deal is off. I don't want it anymore." She was shaking in fear on the inside, but she chose to put on a brave face, not wanting to give Damon the satisfaction that he was inside her head. "You really didn't read through it, did you?" he scoffed. "There's no backing out. It says it right there. You are forced to stay in this estate until the deal is made." "Really? It did?" Violet was taken aback. She wanted to get it over with so fast, she didn't read the paper carefully enough that night. "So what are you gonna do? You're gonna keep me here forever?" she asked challengingly. "No." He shook his head and stifled a laugh. Damon's hand reached up to cup her chin, and Violet tried to struggle away, but to no avail. His grip on her was strong and firm. "Make no mistake, I will take your virginity. But you won't know when or how and where. Or just how hard I would go." He smirked, that signature evil grin of his, and cocked his head to the side. "You are mine now, sweet girl. You better get used to it." Damon leaned his face closer to her, and Violet scrunched her eyes shut in fear. His lips were so close to her, she could feel his warm breaths fanning her cheek. Violet's entire body was shaking, and Damon could see right through it. He let out another laugh before pulling away from her. Violet had no more strength in her body, that she was slumping down. If it weren't for the wall behind her, her knees wouldn't be able to keep her standing up. Damon turned around and headed for the door. But he stopped himself before he fully walked out. "Oh, and one more thing," he said. He turned his eyes back at her and let out a triumphant smile. "When I do take your virginity, I promise I'll make it hurt." With that promise hanging in the air, Damon exited the room, leaving Violet alone with her fear and regrets.